The bank doors of redemption exploded inward, a cannonade of splintered pine and shattered glass that sent the town's lazy afternoon stupor into a panic. Dust thick as sin billowed into the street, followed by men whose faces were hidden behind red bandanas. Jacob Hale felt the concussion in his bones, the hammer in his hand, faltering mid-swing over a glowing horseshoe. From the open doors of his smithy, he watched the townsfolk scatter like quail, their screams swallowed by the oppressive heat. He did not move. For 5 years he had taught himself stillness, forging a wall of apathy around the hollow space where his life used to be. The world could burn, and he would only feel the heat on his skin. The leader of the gang stepped out of the swirling dust, a tall man in a fine black coat, strangely clean amidst the chaos. He moved with an unnerving grace, a wolf among sheep, and his voice when it rose was not the crude bark of an outlaw, but the smooth, commanding tone of a preacher. "Patience, good people of redemption," he called his words, cutting through the fear. "This is a simple transaction. Your cooperation will be remembered." Jacob's jaw tightened. He turned back to the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, a defiant counterpoint to the town's terror. "Not your fight." He told himself the words, a familiar bitter mantra. His fighting days had ended in smoke and ash, buried with his wife Sarah and their little girl Clara. But the world refused to leave him be. The bank manager, Mr. Hemlock, was shoved onto the porch, a pistol pressed to his temple. A woman shrieked as one of the robbers dragged her from the general store, using her as a shield. Jacob's knuckles whitened on the hammer's shaft. The ghosts of his past whispered, reminding him of duty of the marshal's star he had thrown into a river. He gritted his teeth and plunged the horseshoe into the quenching barrel, the hiss of steam, a mirror of the rage he was drowning inside. The leader, Silas Blackwood, directed his men with quiet hand signals, his composure absolute. He was not just robbing a bank. He was conducting an orchestra of violence. As his men loaded saddlebags with cash, Silas paused, his gaze sweeping over the terrified faces huddled in the street. Then from a vest pocket, he drew a small object, something that glinted in the harsh sun. He held it for a moment, a gesture of private contemplation, before it slipped from his gloved fingers and fell into the red dust. It was a silver locket engraved with a delicate vine pattern. Jacob froze. The world tilted, the clang of the smithy fading into a roar in his ears. That locket. It was identical to the one he had given Sarah on their wedding day. The one she was wearing the night of the fire. He remembered the feel of its cool metal in his palm and the tiny clasp he had fastened around her neck. A memory sharp and agonizing tore through the walls he had so carefully built, Sarah laughing, her hand at her throat, where the locket rested, the firelight dancing in her eyes. Then another image, a nightmare he could never escape, the same fire, no longer dancing but devouring, and the locket lost somewhere in the searing heat and collapsing timber. The sight of it lying in the dust cracked him open. This wasn't a random robbery. It was a desecration. The past was not dead. It had just ridden into his town wearing a black coat and a cold smile. Without thinking, Jacob dropped his hammer. The heavy thud echoed the final beat of his old life. He moved from the shadows of his smithy into the blinding sun, his steps deliberate, each one dismantling 5 years of self-imposed exile. The townsfolk stared, their fear momentarily replaced by shock. Jacob Hale, the silent blacksmith, who spoke only in grunts and kept his eyes on the ground, was walking toward the bank robbers. Silas Blackwood turned, his eyes cold and intelligent, fixing on Jacob. A flicker of curiosity crossed his features. "The blacksmith," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "Have you come to offer your services?" Jacob's gaze was locked on the locket. "That trinket you dropped," he said, his voice a low, rusty growl. "Where did you get it?" Silas followed his gaze, a slow smile spreading across his lips. He bent down with an unhurried elegance and picked it up, wiping the dust away with his thumb. "A memento," he said softly, his eyes never leaving Jacob's. "From a life that was taken from me. A reminder of a debt that has yet to be paid." He turned to his men. "We're done here." They mounted their horses, the hostages shoved aside. Silas swung into his saddle, holding the locket up so it caught the light. He looked directly at Jacob, his smile sharpening. Some ghost's blacksmith refused to be buried. With a sharp command, the gang spurred their horses thundering out of town and leaving a cloud of dust and silence in their wake. Jacob stood alone in the street, the sun beating down on him, his shadow long and solitary. But he was no longer just a blacksmith. The sight of that locket had rekindled a fire he thought long extinguished. He was a U.S. Marshal again, whether he wore the star or not, and his past had just given him a name, Silas Blackwood. Redemption was a town forged from dust and desperation, clinging to the edge of the frontier. Its red sand glowed under the relentless sun, baking the life out of the unpainted clapboard buildings and wearying the faces of its inhabitants. Hope came in the form of a rumor, the Transcontinental Railroad, a river of iron and steam that promised to connect them to the civilized world. But where hope flowed, vultures were sure to follow. Silas Blackwood and his men were merely the latest flock. In the days following the robbery, a brittle tension settled over the town. People spoke in whispers, their eyes darting to the shadows. Sheriff Miller, an aging lawman with a drooping mustache and shoulders stooped by the weight of too many years, and too few deputies, did his best to restore order. But redemption's peace was as fragile as a pane of glass in a hailstorm. Jacob returned to his forge, but the work was mechanical, his mind elsewhere. The rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil no longer brought him solace. It was a countdown. The image of the locket was seared into his thoughts, a brand marking him. He had spent 5 years trying to forget the fire, telling himself it was a tragic accident, a stray ember from the hearth. But Blackwood's words, "a life that was taken from me," suggested something far more sinister. Sheriff Miller found him there, leaning against the doorframe of the smithy, the scent of coal smoke and hot iron thick in the air. "Jacob," he began, his voice raspy. "The circuit judge sent a wire. Wants to know what I'm doing about Blackwood." Jacob didn't look up from the horseshoe he was shaping. "Tell him you're doing all you can." I told him I had a former U.S. Marshal living in my town who seems more interested in shoeing horses than stopping killers. Miller's words were a clear provocation, but Jacob refused the bait. "That Marshal is dead, Sheriff. He died in a fire 5 years ago." Miller sighed, stepping into the smithy. The heat was stifling, but he didn't seem to notice. "I was there, Jacob. I saw what was left. I also saw the man you were before. You can't tell me seeing that gang ride roughshod over this town didn't stir something in you." He paused, his gaze softening. "I saw your face when Blackwood dropped that locket. It was Sarah's, wasn't it?" Jacob's hammer fell silent. He placed it carefully on the anvil, his back still to the sheriff. "It looked like it." "Looked like it." Miller scoffed. "A man doesn't walk into gunfire for something that looked like it. Blackwood knew you. He spoke your name. There's a connection here, and you're the only one who can untangle it." Before Jacob could answer, a shadow fell across the doorway. They both turned to see a figure stumbling toward them, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon light. As she drew closer, they saw it was a woman, her dress torn and caked with dust, her face pale with exhaustion. She clutched a swaddled bundle to her chest, her movements desperate and unsteady. She collapsed against the doorframe, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "Please." She gasped, her eyes wide with a fear so profound it seemed to have carved hollows into her cheeks. You have to help me." Jacob's first instinct was to turn away, to retreat back into the fortress of his solitude. But the woman was holding a baby, its small face still and waxen. Miller moved forward, his hand outstretched. "Easy, ma'am. You're safe here." The woman flinched, her eyes darting past the sheriff to fix on Jacob. It was as if she saw something in his hardened face, the ghost of the lawman, perhaps, that offered a sliver of hope. "Are you the blacksmith?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. The one who faced him. Jacob's gut tightened. Faced who? Her gaze flickered toward the empty street, as if she expected to see him standing there. "Silas Blackwood," she breathed. "He's not just a thief. He's a ghost, and he's hunting me." The name landed in the silence of the smithy like a stone. Miller looked at Jacob, his expression a mixture of vindication and concern. Jacob stared at the woman, at the infant in her arms, and knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that his past had not just ridden into town. It had just walked through his door, begging for sanctuary. His life of quiet, solitary penance was officially over. Jacob led the woman, who introduced herself as Elena, into the small living quarters behind the forge. She sank onto a simple wooden chair, her body trembling with exhaustion, but her grip on the infant never wavered. Sheriff Miller followed, his expression grim. "Start from the beginning, ma'am," Miller said, gently pouring her a cup of water. Elena drank greedily, her hands shaking. After a moment, she looked up, her gaze settling on Jacob. Her voice was stronger now, laced with a desperate intelligence. "My name is Elena. I was traveling by stagecoach to join my sister when Blackwood's gang attacked. They weren't after the payroll. They were after me." Why Jacob's question was blunt, cutting through the sheriff's softer approach. Elena flinched. "Silas. He believes I have something that belongs to him." She looked down at the sleeping baby in her arms, her expression a mixture of fierce love and profound sorrow. "He's wrong. She belongs with me." Miller leaned forward. "You said he was a ghost. What did you mean by that?" A shadow passed over Elena's face. "Because he should be dead. Silas Blackwood died 5 years ago. I was there when they buried him." The air in the room grew thick. Jacob felt a cold dread creep up his spine. 5 years ago, the same year as the fire, where he asked, his voice low. "In a small town east of the territories," she said. "After the fire that—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "The fire that killed my sister, his wife." Jacob felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. He stared at Elena, the pieces clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The locket wasn't just like Sarah's. There were 2 of them. Twin lockets. He had bought them from a traveling jeweler, one for his wife and one for her sister, who had married a man named Silas Blackwood and moved away. He had forgotten, buried the memory under an avalanche of grief. "Your sister?" Jacob began, his voice hoarse. "Was she Sarah's sister too?" Elena's eyes widened in stunned recognition. She looked from Jacob's scarred hands to the deep lines of grief etched on his face. You're Jacob Hale," she whispered. "Sarah's husband." The confirmation hit him with the force of a physical blow. This woman was his sister-in-law. The baby in her arms was his niece, and the man hunting them was the husband of the other victim of the fire that had destroyed his life. The coincidence was too great, too monstrous to be an accident. Sheriff Miller, sensing the deep current of history flowing between them, spoke quietly. "Jacob, this changes things." Jacob barely heard him. He was trapped in the past, the smoke of that terrible night filling his lungs again. Blackwood hadn't just stumbled upon his town. He had come here for a reason, and that reason was tied to the fire. "He has to be stopped," Elena said, her voice regaining its strength. "He's not the man my sister married. That fire, it twisted him. He's obsessed with what he calls his legacy." The word echoed Blackwood's own debt that has yet to be paid. This was not about money. It was about something far more personal. Jacob straightened the blacksmith's stoop, giving way to the rigid posture of a lawman. The reluctance that had chained him for 5 years shattered. This was no longer just about a locket. It was about the truth of the night that had cost him everything. He had a duty not only to protect the living, but to seek justice for the dead. He turned to Miller. "Get a wire to the U.S. Marshal's office in Fort Smith. Tell them Jacob Hale is officially requesting his reinstatement. And tell them Silas Blackwood is alive." Miller nodded, a flicker of relief in his tired eyes. "What are you going to do?" Jacob's gaze fell on Elena and the child. He was being asked to protect another family, a thought that was both a torment and a strange, unexpected comfort. First, Jacob set his voice hard as the anvil he stood beside. "I'm going to find out why a dead man is robbing banks and chasing ghosts. And then I'm going to bury him for good." Jacob's decision to re-engage with the world he had abandoned sent ripples through redemption. He agreed to shelter Elena and the baby, whose name he learned was Lily, in his small home behind the smithy. The arrangement was a constant, painful reminder of the family he had lost, yet it also sparked a flicker of purpose in the hollow chambers of his heart. His first step was not to ride out with guns blazing, but to do what he had once done best: investigate. He met Sheriff Miller in his dusty office, the scent of stale coffee and old paper hanging in the air. Maps of the territory were pinned to the wall, marked with locations of recent raids. "That man, Blackwood," Miller said, tracing a line with his finger. "He wasn't just after money, Jacob. He was looking for something, or someone. Every stagecoach he hit, every surveyor camp he raided, was connected to the railroad expansion." The railroad, Jacob mused. It seemed too big, too impersonal for a vendetta. Why would he care about that? That's the question, isn't it? Miller leaned back, his chair creaking. "He's disrupting their work, scaring off investors. It's like he's trying to stop it from ever reaching this territory." "But for what? The railroad brings money, progress. Or it buries secrets," Jacob countered his mind, turning over the new information. The fire, the railroad, Blackwood's resurrection, it was all a tangled knot. His investigation was hampered by an external threat. Blackwood's men hadn't entirely left the area. Jacob spotted them at the edge of town, shadowy figures watching from the bluffs, their presence a constant, silent promise of violence. They were waiting, observing. It made Jacob a prisoner in his own town, and the weight of protecting Elena and Lily grew heavier with each passing day. The obstacle was also internal. The skills of a marshal were not like riding a bicycle. They were a heavy coat he had shrugged off, and putting it back on felt alien. Every instinct he had suppressed for 5 years screamed at him, and the ghosts of past failures whispered doubts in his ear. Back at the smithy, a tense alliance was forming between Jacob and Elena. She was wary and grief-stricken, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. She decided to trust him, sharing fragments of her story. "My sister Annabelle was Silas's wife," she explained one evening, her voice soft as she rocked a sleeping Lily. "She was a writer, a journalist, for a small paper back east. She was brilliant and fearless. She believed the railroad was going to cheat settlers out of their land claims. She was investigating its chief baron, a man named Alistair Finch." The name was unfamiliar to Jacob, but the motive was not. Greed was a story as old as the dirt beneath their feet. Silas supported her, Elena continued. He was a surveyor himself, and he saw the corruption firsthand. They were building a case against Finch. Annabelle kept all her notes in a ledger. Her voice broke. The ledger was lost in the fire. The same fire that killed her and your Sarah and Clara. Jacob felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The official report said it was an accident. Faulty chimney flue. Elena looked at him, her eyes burning with a conviction that unsettled him. Annabelle was too careful for that. She was afraid. The week before the fire, she sent me a letter. She said she had found proof something that could ruin Finch for good. She said she was meeting with a U.S. Marshal who was also looking into Finch. Jacob stared at her, the blood draining from his face. A marshal? Yes, Elena said. She never wrote his name. But Jacob knew. He had been that marshal. He had been quietly building a case against Finch, collecting evidence of fraud and intimidation. He had scheduled a secret meeting with an informant he now realized was Annabelle Blackwood. But he never made it to that meeting. He had been called away on urgent business, a manufactured crisis that pulled him 2 days' ride away. By the time he returned, his home was a smoking ruin, his family was gone, and his star felt like a lead weight in his pocket. The official story was a lie. His hesitation, his by-the-book caution, had gotten them all killed. As this revelation settled, Jacob was plagued by nightmares. He was back at the fire, the heat scorching his skin and the screams of his family echoing in his ears. But this time, the dream was different. He saw a third person in the swirling smoke, a man whose face was always turned away, a shadowy figure feeding the flames. He would wake up in a cold sweat at the identity of the arsonist just beyond his grasp. The tension in redemption finally broke a few days later. Elena, desperate for a breath of fresh air, had walked to the general store with Lily. Jacob, watching from his smithy, saw one of Blackwood's men step out of an alley, his eyes fixed on her. The man moved to grab her. Jacob didn't shout. He didn't draw a gun. He crossed the street with a speed that belied his size. Before the man could lay a hand on Elena, Jacob's arm shot out, his fingers locking around the man's wrist in a grip of iron. With a sharp twist, he dislocated the man's shoulder, forcing him to his knees with a choked cry of pain. Jacob leaned in close, his voice a lethal whisper. "Go back to Blackwood," he said, his eyes as cold as river stones. "Tell him the blacksmith knows, and tell him I'm coming for him." He released the man, who scrambled away, clutching his ruined arm. The street was silent. The townsfolk stared not at a blacksmith, but at the ghost of a lawman who had just risen from the grave. Jacob stood over Elena and the child to protect her once more. The stakes were no longer just about his past. They were about a future he had to ensure this new family would have. Days later, a new player arrived in redemption. He was a man in a bowler hat and a city suit that looked out of place against the backdrop of dust and tumbleweeds. He introduced himself to Sheriff Miller as Mr. Davies, an agent for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired by the railroad to investigate the disruptions. Jacob was summoned to the sheriff's office. Davies was a man of sharp angles and sharper words, his eyes missing nothing. "Sheriff Miller tells me you have a history with our mutual problem." Mr. Hale Davies began, his tone clipped and professional. "My employers are losing a great deal of money because of Silas Blackwood. They want him stopped." "So do I," Jacob said flatly. "Good. Then perhaps you can shed some light on his motives. Our intelligence suggests he isn't stealing for profit. He burns payrolls, destroys equipment. It's sabotage, pure and simple. Why would a man want to stop the march of progress?" "Maybe he believes progress is just another word for corruption," Jacob replied, thinking of Annabelle's investigation. Davies raised a skeptical eyebrow. An idealist with a gun, a dangerous combination. We have reason to believe he is not working alone. He has a benefactor, someone funding his operations. The idea of a benefactor complicated things. Blackwood wasn't just a grieving husband on a quest for revenge. He was a pawn in a larger game, a game that likely involved Alistair Finch. That evening, the game came to Jacob. He was walking back to the smithy after a final talk with Miller when a figure stepped from the shadows of the livery stable. It was Silas Blackwood. He was alone, his hands empty, his posture relaxed. It was not the stance of a man looking for a gunfight. Blacksmith Silas said, his voice calm. Jacob's hand went to the pistol tucked into his belt. "Don't," Silas warned, his gaze steady. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm here to talk, man to man, father to father." The words struck Jacob as bizarre, nonsensical. "You and I have nothing to talk about." "Oh, I think we do," Silas said, taking a step closer. The faint light from a nearby lantern illuminated his face. There was no malice in his eyes, only a profound and weary sorrow. "You've taken something that belongs to me. You're sheltering a thief." "Elena is a desperate woman protecting a child," Jacob growled. Silas's expression tightened. "She is a desperate woman, I'll grant you that. But she is not protecting a child. She is hiding my child." The world seemed to stop. Jacob stared at him, unable to process the words. "The child," Silas continued, his voice thick with an emotion Jacob recognized as grief, "the baby you call Lily. She is not Elena's. She is my daughter." The revelation hit Jacob with the force of a physical blow. It was impossible. It made no sense. "Elena is her aunt," Silas explained, his voice breaking for the first time. "My wife Annabelle gave birth to our daughter just hours before the fire. She never even had the chance to hold her properly. Elena was there helping with the delivery. When the fire started, she fled with the baby, leaving Annabelle and everyone else to burn. She has been running ever since." Silas looked at Jacob, his eyes pleading. "You think this is about greed, about a railroad? This is about blood. My blood. The only piece of my wife I have left in this world. You, a man who lost a child, should understand that." The twist was so profound, so utterly unexpected, that it shattered Jacob's entire understanding of the conflict. He was not protecting a mother and child from a monster. He was standing between a grieving father and his only daughter. Silas Blackwood was no longer a simple villain. He was a tragic figure twisted by the same fire that had consumed Jacob's own life. And Jacob, the man who would have given anything to have his Clara back, was now denying another man that very same right. The weight of Silas's revelation pressed down on Jacob as he returned to the smithy. The scent of food, the sound of Elena humming softly to the baby, it all felt like a lie. He found her by the hearth, Lily sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle. "We need to talk," Jacob said, his voice devoid of warmth. Elena looked up, her smile fading when she saw the grim set of his face. She knew somehow that the fragile peace they had found was about to break. He confronted her directly, his words like stones. "Silas Blackwood says Lily is his daughter." Elena's face went white. She stood up, her hands twisting in her apron. For a moment she seemed ready to deny it, but the lie died on her lips. Tears streamed down her face as she sank back into her chair, her body racked with sobs. "It's true," she whispered, her voice choked with guilt and fear. "Why?" Jacob demanded, the single word carrying the weight of his betrayal. "Why did you lie?" "Because you don't know him," she cried, her voice rising. "Not the man he became after the fire." He's not a father seeking his child. He's a man possessed by vengeance. He sees Lily not as a daughter, but as a weapon, a legacy to be used in his war against Finch and the world. He's ruthless, Jacob. He would raise her in the shadow of his hatred, surrounded by violence and death. I couldn't let that happen. Annabelle wouldn't have wanted that for her. Her confession was filled with grief, a desperate attempt to do right by her sister in the only way she knew how. Jacob's anger began to cool, replaced by a deep, unsettling moral confusion. He had given his word to protect them. But to whom did his duty lie now? To the aunt who offered love and safety, or to the father who offered blood and a birthright, however tainted by revenge? His dilemma was not given time to fester. Silas, having failed to persuade Jacob with words, escalated his tactics. The next morning, the town of Redemption woke to find its only water tower sabotaged, the precious supply draining into the thirsty red sand. By noon, notices were posted on every corner, signed by Silas Blackwood. They offered a staggering bounty for the return of his daughter, Lily Blackwood, and a pardon for anyone who helped him. The town turned on Jacob overnight. The whispers that had once been about his tragic past now became accusations. He was harboring a kidnapper. He was the reason their water was gone. He was inviting a war into their streets. The faces that had once looked at him with pity now stared with suspicion and hostility. Men who had once nodded a polite greeting now spat in the dust as he passed. Sheriff Miller tried to hold the line, but he was one man against a tide of fear and greed. "The bounty is turning them," he told Jacob, his face grim. "They see you not as a protector, but as a threat to their own safety." Jacob was isolated again. But this time it was not by choice. He was a pariah holed up in his smithy, guarding a child whose father was systematically turning an entire town into a posse. The second obstacle was no longer just a moral one. It was a siege. The world was shrinking around him, and he knew Silas would not stop until the walls of the smithy and Jacob's resolve came crumbling down. The sky turned a sickly yellow, and the sun blotted out by a churning cloud of sand. A storm was coming, one of the vicious gales that could strip paint from wood and sanity from a man. It was the perfect cover. Under the rising howl of the wind, Jacob bundled a sleeping Lily and led Elena out the back of the smithy. The town was hunkered down, doors and windows shuttered against the coming tempest. They slipped through the deserted streets, the wind tearing at their clothes and stinging their eyes with grit. Their destination was the old abandoned church at the edge of town, its steeple a skeletal finger pointing at the bruised sky. It was the one place Jacob believed they would be safe, at least for a while. The inside was cavernous and cold, smelling of decay and forgotten hymns. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light, piercing the grimy stained glass windows. A massive broken clock tower ticked loudly in the steeple above its erratic rhythm, a maddening heartbeat for the storm. They had barely settled in the back pews when the main doors creaked open. Silas Blackwood stood there, a silhouette against the swirling sand. He was alone, his black coat whipping around him, his face etched with a grim finality. "There is nowhere left to run, Jacob," he said, his voice carrying easily over the wind's moan. He walked down the center aisle, his boots echoing on the dusty floorboards. He wasn't holding a weapon. Jacob pushed Elena and Lily behind the altar, stepping forward to meet him. "This ends here, Silas." "Yes," Silas agreed, stopping a few feet away. "It does. But not in the way you think." He looked past Jacob, his gaze softening as it fell on the bundle in Elena's arms. "My daughter," he whispered, a universe of pain in the words. "She's not a prize to be won," Jacob said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Silas's eyes snapped back to him, the sorrow replaced by a flash of fire. "You still don't understand. This was never just about getting her back. It was about justice. Justice for her mother, for your wife, for your child. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The fire that killed our families, Jacob. It was no accident. I know, Jacob said. It was Alistair Finch. He killed them to cover up his crimes. A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Silas's lips. Finch gave the order, yes. He's a monster who deserves to hang. But he isn't the only one to blame. He locked eyes with Jacob, and the look in them was one of profound, soul-deep accusation. I don't just blame him. I blame you, Marshal. The word struck Jacob like a physical blow. What are you talking about? Your hesitation. Silas roared, his voice cracking with 5 years of repressed fury. Your by-the-book caution, Annabel told me all about you. The great Marshal Hale, so careful, so methodical. You had evidence against Finch for months, but you waited gathering more, wanting an ironclad case. Annabel was ready to publish. She told you she had the ledger, the final piece of the puzzle. But you told her to wait. You told her it was too dangerous to act alone. The memory hit Jacob with the force of a locomotive. He remembered the coded telegram from Annabel, the urgency in her words, and his own cautious reply, urging patience until he could return. That hesitation was a death sentence. Silas spat, his face contorted with grief. While you were cautiously building your perfect case, Finch's men were dousing our homes in kerosene. Your wife and daughter died because you were too slow. My wife died because you told her to wait for a law that was never coming. I'm not just reclaiming my daughter, Jacob. I'm claiming the justice you failed to deliver. This secondary twist was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just a vendetta against Finch. It was a personal judgment on Jacob. Silas saw him as the lawman who had failed the man whose inaction had cost them everything. The weight of that truth crushed Jacob. He was guilty. His caution, his professionalism, the very things that had made him a good marshal, had led to the slaughter of his family. As this realization dawned, the broken clock in the tower above chimed once, a loud, discordant clang that seemed to signal the final act. Silas, his face a mask of rage and sorrow, finally drew his pistol. Finch took their lives, he said, his voice trembling. But you let him. The gunfight that followed was not a duel of heroes and villains. It was an explosive, desperate clash between two broken men, both fighting for redemption in the ruins of their lives. Gunshots echoed through the church, drowned out by the howling sandstorm. They fought with a savage intimacy, their battle a physical manifestation of their shared tragedy and guilt. They crashed through pews, their fists finding purchase, their bodies slamming against the cold, unfeeling stone of the altar. It was a fight for a child, for justice, and for the soul of a man who had failed to protect those he loved. Jacob lunged, tackling Silas, as another blast of wind tore a shutter from a high window, sending a vortex of sand and debris swirling through the church. They rolled across the floor, grappling for control of the pistol. Jacob's knuckles were raw, his lungs burning. But Silas fought with the ferocious strength of a man who had nothing left to lose. He was fueled by 5 years of pure, distilled grief. With a final desperate heave, Jacob wrenched the gun from Silas's grasp and threw it skittering into the darkness. But in the struggle, his own pistol had been knocked free. They were disarmed, 2 men left, with nothing but their fists and their fury. Silas drove an elbow into Jacob's ribs, and Jacob answered with a blow that sent Silas staggering back against the pulpit. "You think this absolves you?" Silas gasped, wiping blood from his lip. "Killing me won't bring them back." "This isn't about absolution," Jacob grunted, circling him. "It's about saving the one person we have left." He charged again, but Silas was ready. He sidestepped and slammed a heavy hymnal into the side of Jacob's head. Stars exploded behind Jacob's eyes as he fell to one knee. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Elena cry out his name. The sound, the fear for him in her voice, cleared his head. He looked up to see Silas looming over him, raising the book for a final blow. Jacob swept his leg out, catching Silas behind the knees and sending him crashing to the floor. Jacob was on him in an instant, his hands closing around Silas's throat. But he didn't squeeze. He looked down into the eyes of the man who was his mirror, a father hollowed out by loss, a husband consumed by a need for justice. He saw his own pain reflected there, and the rage inside him finally broke. "It was my fault," Jacob choked out the admission tearing from his soul. "You're right, I was too slow. I should have been there." Silas's body went slack beneath him, the fight draining out of him, as he heard the confession he had waited 5 years to hear. Tears welled in his eyes, mingling with the blood and dust on his face. At that moment, a floorboard creaked from the choir loft above. Both men looked up to see one of Silas's men, a rifle leveled at Jacob's back. He must have followed Silas, waiting for his moment. Before the man could fire, Silas shoved Jacob aside with all his remaining strength. The rifle shot cracked through the storm, but the bullet found Silas, not Jacob. It struck him high in the chest, throwing him back against the altar steps. Jacob, reacting on pure instinct, scooped up a fallen candelabra and hurled it at the loft. It struck the gunman, sending him toppling over the railing with a strangled cry. Silence fell in the church, broken only by the wind and Silas's ragged breathing. Jacob crawled to his side. The wound was mortal. "Silas," Jacob whispered, pressing a hand to the wound, a futile gesture against the inevitable. Silas coughed a bloody froth on his lips. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a worn leather-bound ledger. He pressed it into Jacob's hands. "Annabelle's," he rasped. "I found it in the wreckage. Everything is in there. Finch's accounts, his paid men. The proof you needed." He looked toward the shadows where Elena was clutching Lily. A look of profound peace settled on his features. "Save my daughter," he whispered, his voice fading. "From men like him, and from men like me." His eyes glazed over his final breath, a quiet sigh that was swallowed by the storm. Jacob knelt there for a long moment, the heavy ledger in his hands and the weight of Silas's sacrifice settling upon him. He had won the fight, but the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He had been given a second chance, paid for by the life of the man who had been both his enemy and his brother in grief. He stood turned to Elena and knew what he had to do. With Silas's ledger, he would not just end a chapter of his own life. He would fulfill the last wish of a fallen man and deliver the justice they had all been denied for so long. The sandstorm abated as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world scoured clean. In the quiet aftermath, Jacob took the ledger to Sheriff Miller and the Pinkerton agent Davies. The book was a meticulous record of Alistair Finch's corruption, complete with names, dates, and account numbers, Annabelle's final damning testament. Davies, for all his city cynicism, was visibly impressed. This is more than we ever hoped for," he said, turning the pages with reverence. "This ledger will not just ruin Finch, it will dismantle his entire enterprise. With the full backing of the railroad and the authority of the law, Finch was arrested within the week. His empire crumbled, and the men who had enacted his brutal will were rounded up, including the arsonist from Jacob's nightmare, whose name was listed in the ledger's margins. Justice, slow and grinding, had finally arrived. The town of Redemption was saved from the railroad's corruption, and the names of Jacob Hale and Silas Blackwood were cleared, their tragic stories now part of the town's lore. Months passed. The harshness of winter gave way to the tentative green of spring. The railroad under new and honest leadership began to lay tracks a few miles south of town, its promise of connection no longer a threat, but a genuine hope. Redemption began to heal, and so did Jacob. One clear, cool morning, he rode out to the small windswept hill where his family was buried. He carried with him two objects, the silver locket that had been Sarah's, and the identical one he had recovered from Silas. He knelt between the simple wooden markers, the silence broken only by the whisper of the wind through the prairie grass. He held the lockets in his palm, their combined weight a symbol of a shared, devastating loss. They represented not just his wife and Silas's, but the lives that had been intertwined and destroyed by a single act of greed. With a quiet prayer, he dug a small hole in the earth between the graves and placed both lockets inside, burying them together. It was an act of letting go, not of the memory of his wife and child, but of the guilt that had haunted him for 5 long years. He was honoring all the victims of the fire, finally closing the book on their tragedy. He returned to the smithy, the rhythmic clang of his hammer, once again a familiar and welcome sound. But it was no longer the sound of a man hiding from the world. It was the sound of a man building a new one. Elena was there, hanging laundry in the small yard behind the forge, the sunlight catching in her hair. Lily, now a healthy, babbling toddler, sat on a blanket at her feet, playing with a set of wooden blocks. Their life together was quiet, unspoken. They were not replacing the families they had lost, but creating something new from the wreckage, a bond forged in shared sorrow and survival. Jacob walked over, wiping the soot from his hands. He knelt beside Lily and held out a small object he had spent the morning carving. It was a wooden horse, its lines simple, but full of life. Lily looked at it, her eyes wide with wonder, and reached for it with her small, chubby hands. As her fingers closed around the toy, she looked up at Jacob and broke into a wide, toothless grin. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. He looked at Elena, and she smiled back, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. In that quiet moment of understanding, he found the resolution he had been searching for. His quest for vengeance had ended, but his journey toward redemption had led him to an unexpected future, a fragile hope blooming in the dust. For the first time since the fire, Jacob Hale smiled a real smile, born not of memory, but of a life that was just beginning.